Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Charlie Kelly, the Music and Member Events Manager at the Arts Club. I hope you're all well and have been keeping safe and healthy over these past few challenging months. It's fantastic to see so many of you joining us from all over the globe for this fourth in our hugely popular Giant Conversation series with Space for Giants, as we continue to explore our relationship with the natural world. Today's webinar is titled Valuing Wildlife and Wild Places. We'll be exploring how we make intact natural habitats and wildlife so valuable that they are not exploited for alternative uses. Whilst this is important for species survival and to hedge against global warming, we also know it is critical for preventing another pandemic like COVID-19. However, with each year that passes, it becomes even more apparent that every acre of conservation land, especially in an increasingly crowded planet, needs to prove its economic value. Many of those acres already have immense ecological importance. But in the face of growing human pressure, it is economic value to local people and national governments that will ensure the endurance of natural ecosystems. In this talk, there will be discussion around options to generate value from natural ecosystems and their wildlife, so that they can be protected from exploitation in an increasingly human-dominated world. I am so pleased to introduce Ms. Clare Akamanzi and Mr. Fred Swaniker, who will be joining us for this in-depth discussion. Ms. Akamanzi is an international trade and investment lawyer, CEO of the Rwanda Development Board, and a cabinet member. Clare has served the Rwandan government in several senior positions across the last 15 years, and was named one of Africa's top 50 powerful women by Forbes in 2020. Clare was also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, and earlier this year was appointed as a founding board member of the World Health Organization Foundation. Mr. Swaniker co-founded 3 global organizations: African Leadership Academy, African Leadership Network, and African Leadership University, that all aim to catalyze a new generation of 3 million ethical and entrepreneurial African leaders across a 50-year period. Fred was also a founder and CEO of Terra Education, a global education company that today provides leadership training to approximately 4,000 people annually at 46 sites in 20 countries across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. To moderate the talk, we are very pleased to welcome back Dr. Max Graham, founder and CEO of Space for Giants. If anyone has any questions over the course of the talk, please do type them into the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. And then Dr. Max will field as many of those as possible towards the end of the talk. So please do sit back and enjoy, and I will now pass you over to Dr. Max. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlie, and welcome everyone again to the 4th in our Giants Conversation series. It's fantastic to have so many people joining these webinars. The first webinar looked at the link between disease and the emergence of disease and the illegal wildlife trade. The second webinar looked at stopping the supply of wildlife to source to demand countries. And the third webinar looked at demand for wildlife. Now, this webinar is quite different. What we want to look at here is how do we make wildlife and wild places valuable so that they aren't exploited, so that wildlife doesn't end up in the food chain or being traded internationally, and how do we ensure that these wild places stay intact and continue to provide a hedge against global warming? And it's a huge honor to welcome Clare and Fred onto this webinar. These are 2 titans on the continent, indeed in the world, both in their respective fields, and they've been playing remarkable roles, respectively, in conservation. So, Clare, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. Clare, I think there's perhaps no better illustration of the extent to which wildlife can be valued by a nation than the annual mountain gorilla naming ceremony in Rwanda. I mean, it's quite a remarkable Can you please tell us more about this and what it's done for gorillas in your country?
Thank you very much, Dr. Max, and thank you, Charlie. It's such a great pleasure to join you this evening, and also to be joined by Fred to talk about very, very important topics such as conservation. Now, on this gorilla naming ceremony that we have in Rwanda, it's called Kwitizina, which literally means gorilla naming. And Kwitizina is a very old tradition in the Rwandan culture, which was used to name newborn babies, human babies. And so it wasn't just a parent deciding a name of a child. Naming a child was a very important aspect of Rwandan tradition, whereby a group of people, a family, and a community came together to decide on a name, because a name meant so much about the destiny and the value of that child. And so, because we wanted Rwandans and the Rwandan people and communities to become custodians of conservation and of gorillas, we decided to use this particular tradition that was very well known to Rwandans in their own families to something that could be used for something nationwide, such as gorilla naming or naming of baby gorillas. And that tradition was very important because it's something that Rwandans could identify with. It's something that they valued. And so symbolically, that was the same value we're giving gorillas and conservation by using this tradition for conservation. Now, it wasn't just something that we formalized in 2005. Actually, it's something that park rangers started to use because they had to monitor gorillas in their research work. And to do that, they started giving them names, which was where the inspiration came to actually formalize it and make it a gorilla naming ceremony. Now, since we started in 2005 to date, we've named 300 baby gorillas. They have names. We know, when they give birth, when they have newborns, we know every day how they're doing. We follow them very closely. But more importantly, this gorilla naming ceremony has become a very, very important event to re-emphasize the value of conservation, and not only because they're multiplying and growing and the ecosystem is growing, but also the role that it has in tourism and economic development. And because of that, the communities, Rwandans, have become a lot more custodians of gorillas and conservations in general. Thank you.
Claire, that is absolutely fascinating. So, and I'd love to see more countries engaging in naming ceremonies of their wildlife. We need to have baby elephant naming ceremonies for some countries. I'd like to see that. I don't know what would happen in the UK, maybe baby foxes. Fred, given you've created a tertiary learning infrastructure that aims to train 3 million African leaders by 2060, I think it's safe to say you know how to scale a business that delivers a public sector good. But you're a relative newcomer to conservation, and I'm curious to know what your key impressions are in terms of the scalability of the sector.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here, and nice to see you, Claire. I mean, my love affair with nature has been there for about 2 decades. But I think that more recently have I started aligning it with my professional pursuits by really looking at how we can develop a new generation of leaders through the universities that we're building, who can, help to really fulfill the full potential of wildlife in Africa. So my initial impressions, as what you say, as a relative newcomer to this, is that as an economic sector, this is one that has tremendous unfulfilled potential. And what I mean by that is that as we look at developing Africa, we cannot just copy the rest of the world. We need to think about what we as Africans have that is unique to the continent. And one of the things that we have that no one else has in the whole world, that therefore can be tremendously valuable, that is a competitive advantage, is nature. We have some of the most unique biodiversity in the world that is not found, and that therefore can really be leveraged for growth. There have been 2 big barriers that I see, however, that is preventing this from happening. The first is the mindset. So for too long, conservation has been seen from the perspective of what's good for wildlife, what's good for nature. But in my perspective, nature can take care of itself. People are the problem, right? And so the big shift is that we need to think about what's good for people if we want to really save nature. And when you look at the continent of Africa, poverty levels are so high that we cannot do conservation for conservation's sake. We need to therefore show communities, people, how nature benefits them and how it's the pathway to the prosperity that they need. So what this means is that we need to move away from looking at conservation primarily from a lens of conservation, biology, and ecology, and really think about the politics, the power, the economics of conservation. And that's one of the things that's been, that mindset that's been blocking us from achieving the potential. The second the second barrier that has been preventing this is regulation and the legal framework, the government framework, government support. Because to scale this sector, we need to align the public benefit of conservation, which we all talk about, and for example, which Claire talked about, that is so apparent in Rwanda, with private benefit, because the economy is ultimately driven by entrepreneurs, and South Africa has shown how when you give private citizens the chance to benefit from nature, then that can deliver results. So, for example, in the 1960s, wildlife numbers had dwindled in South Africa to under 1 million. And today, that's well over 15 million, right? In large part because the government enabled the private wildlife ranching industry. And that sector now has much more land under conservation management than the national parks that are conserving the country's wildlife. And so both plants and animals are generating more revenue and jobs than the alternatives of crops and cattle. And that's because legislation was changed in South Africa to allow private ownership of wildlife, and that's the kind of thing that's been preventing this from achieving its full potential. I'm not saying that South Africa has gotten it all right; it certainly hasn't, but we can learn from how their government has unlocked, the wildlife economy. And finally, one of the things that has been a big surprise to me is just the lack of consistent, comparable data about the size of the wildlife economy. There's very little data about it, and that's why. Today, it's very difficult to actually value the wildlife economy. And I believe that is one of the main reasons why governments don't invest in it as much, because they actually don't realize how much is really contributing. And so that's why at the School of Conservation, we recently launched a research study to quantify how big this is as a sector of the economy. So how many jobs does it create? How much GDP comes from wildlife, taxes, foreign exchange? How much is being contributed to communities? And it's still early days here, but some of our findings are surprisingly big. So for example, in Kenya, 1.1 million jobs comes from nature conservation, and about 5% of the workforce, and contributes about $2 billion in terms of tourism, etc., that's coming into the country. In South Africa, it's about $6 billion, almost 3% of GDP is coming from the sector. So there's huge potential, and it just hasn't been quantified. And I believe it's one of the hidden gems that could actually really be used to develop Africa, and therefore align the interests of people with the interests of nature.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That last point, especially the realignment of people's vested interests with the desire to maintain the important public good that are natural ecosystems. Really interesting. Thank you, Fred. Claire, the story of Rwanda's transformation from the ashes of genocide to one of the most developed economies in Africa is truly remarkable. I'm curious to know what role wildlife has played in this.
Thank you, Max. I think building on the point that Fred made, which is how do you balance conservation and improving the lives of people, because people must see the benefit of conservation. And that's really the approach that we've taken in Rwanda. And that approach has been looking at wildlife as wealth, important wealth for the nation. So how do you safeguard the wealth? How do you grow that wealth, which is the wildlife? But at the same time, how do you translate that into growing the wealth of the people as well? That has really been what has guided our thinking in Rwanda, very much in line with what Fred was making a case for. And what the result has been over time is that today, if you look at the contribution of tourism and conservation to our economy, it's directly and indirectly 7% of our GDP. And if you look at the foreign exchange earnings, tourism and conservation bring in the highest forex earnings in the country at about $500 million, compared with coffee, tea, and minerals. Tourism is earning a lot more than these industries that are more traditional in Rwanda. And so that just shows clearly how tourism and conservation has been very, very important in terms of job creation, foreign exchange earnings, but also the image of the country, connecting Rwanda to the rest of the world. I think this has been a very important way of putting Rwanda on the map as well, which brings other benefits to the economy. Investments, if you look at investments in hotels, just 10 years ago, there was no global brand in Rwanda. Today we have, lodges such as Singita, Wilderness Safari, Bisate Lodge. We have One and Only, we have Marriott, we have Radisson. These brands were not available in Rwanda just 10 years ago. But because of the success of tourism and conservation, we've begun to also create jobs through investment opportunities, partnerships. Tour operators are much more busier and more in number than they were before. So making sure that while we promote tourism for job creation and wealth, we continue to also promote conservation, because we want this wealth, that is the wildlife that we have, to be sustainable in the long term. And that's why, if I could just end with this, that's why, for example, for our biggest source of tourism, it's been the gorillas. But we've been very careful about how we promote and create that balance for gorillas, because gorillas, if you have so many people visiting, it really affects the long-term conservation of what gorillas can take. And so we decided to make our gorilla tourism a high-end, low-volume conservation. So we have a limit of 96 people a day, eight people per group of gorilla families. But we charge $1,500 for everyone who goes to see gorillas. We've put a little bit of discounts because of COVID-19, but it was a high volume. It was a very high value but low volume offering, which is really to protect the conservation but make money from it at the same time. Thank you.
Yeah. Claire, thanks. And that's really interesting that gorillas were actually sort of a pillar for economic development in Rwanda, and it's a wonderful story. Fred, Rwanda's they're fortunately they're endowed with these habituated gorillas, and of course they've got visionary leadership, which has helped to build the wildlife economy. But mountain gorillas are actually very rare, and based on the research of your team, which you've assembled over the last few years, what other enterprises can give the greatest hope for building not just African but global economies, do you think?
Certainly. So, Rwanda is a great example of a country that has used what it has to really develop and in terms of its wildlife assets. But there's so much richness in other parts of Africa that is completely untapped. So, from our perspective, there are 4 big opportunities that can really be leveraged to bring value to wildlife and to benefit people as well. Number 1 is tourism, obviously. And we've seen the example that Claire just shared from Rwanda. Another example, the Masai Mara Conservancies alone last year, they earned about $5 million from conservation. The Kenya Conservancies employ about 5,000 people and benefit over 700,000 households. And so that's a big one. And I think that's hugely untapped. Africa has, is one of the least visited places in the world. And I think we can, especially attract global visitors and make it something that generates foreign exchange. Hunting is another big opportunity. In South Africa, for example, almost $1 billion contributed to the economy from hunting. And I know that's controversial, but it's actually one of the most important ways of sustaining wildlife economies. Number 3 is carbon and other ecosystem services. So especially in today's world of COVID-19, when travel has gone down, this, I believe, is a really, really important opportunity. It's a huge untapped opportunity. I recently learned of some companies that want to commit about $400 million to offset the carbon that they're producing. And they're actually now struggling to find the supply of, for assets that they can actually use to offset the carbon that they're producing. Right? We should be capitalizing on this opportunity, and that can flow directly to communities so that they can see the value of not cutting down their forests, et cetera, because someone's literally paying them to not do that. And the carbon opportunity, I believe, lies in both in terrestrial carbon and also oceans. There's a huge opportunity in mangroves, blue carbon, really untapped. In general, we literally as human beings cannot breathe, we cannot eat, we cannot quench our thirst without nature. So it's one of the most fundamental ingredients to life on Earth, yet we don't value it. And so one of the things that's going to unlock the full value of what's called ecosystem services is that we need to really change legislation so that we can value the full cost of using nature. You know, factories that use water for food production, manufacturing, they don't pay as much as they could for this, right? For the contribution of nature. You know, we need to really rebalance this whole thing, and so that we can price this public good into all the products that we consume, and then that the income that's generated can go to support the ecosystem. So that's a really big untapped opportunity. The fourth big one is what we call the blue economy, right? So these are the oceans, both fisheries and tourism that can happen on the oceans. But this needs to be very carefully managed to avoid overexploitation. The good news is that if oceans are given just a little bit of respite, they tend to bounce back much faster than terrestrial ecosystems. And so I think that's, again, a really big opportunity. So those are what I call the big four. You know, when people go on safari, they talk about the big five. I would say that these are the big four opportunities for value creation in conservation. There are a few smaller things like wildlife ranching. For example, in South Africa, that contributed about $500 million. In Zambia, about $15 million per annum comes from wildlife ranching. Non-timber forest products. You know, in Kenya, honey production. That is a value of about $40 million and employs about 91,000 people. And that comes from, those little things that we call bees. Wildlife film and photography. That is another, untapped opportunity today, especially when the whole world is looking for content. We're stuck at home, we're watching Netflix, and we've probably finished all those movies, right? Imagine, how much we could create from, wildlife film. And the good thing about that is you don't need to pay your actors, right? You just need to go. So the point is we can just get a lot more creative about how we value nature. And this can actually become a serious economic opportunity for the continent. The final thing I'll say is what I call the Trojan horse of conservation. And this, I think Rwanda is a prime example of that. Conservation can be used as a way to lure people into Africa who come wanting to see the gorillas or to see, the lions, etc. But they get so impressed by the country that they stay and they invest in other things. And so Rwanda has done this so well. People are investing in Rwanda in so many different areas. They came, I first went to Rwanda, for tourism, and I was so impressed with the place that I've now ended up investing and building a university, right? And so Rwanda has shown that, and I think that this is what many presidents in Africa don't get, that, the president of Congo, if you get your act together and really make and attract global tourists to come to see your gorillas and so much else that they have, and then that could actually then be parlayed into much, much more value for the country as those investors, bring money into the country, etc. So that's something that is not often seen when they look at the potential for nature.
That's really interesting. And I'd never heard anyone describe the wildlife sector or wildlife as bait for fishing for investors. So that's a brilliant concept and really, really interesting. Claire, you explained the role that wildlife played in driving Rwanda's phoenix-like rise as a nation. But there are other countries in the region, that are very nearby that are, if not equally, they may be better, they may be better endowed in terms of their wildlife attributes, but they haven't been able to leverage that wildlife in the same way as Rwanda. What is it that Rwanda has done so successfully?
Thank you, Max. First of all, Fred, I like the idea of unpaid actors in the national parks that we can use to create movies. I have taken note of that. Well, I think the factors that we can share as Rwanda that we think has been helpful in elevating tourism and conservation, as has been the case in our country, I probably talk about 5 components quickly. One of them is, I think, leadership at the highest level. having a head of state, our president is the #1 champion of conservation and wildlife. I think that is extremely important at many levels. Number one, being the example to the rest of the country that this is important. If the president is talking about conservation, the president is advocating for more conservation, and if the president is passing laws and regulations that support conservation, then the rest of the country will be inspired to rally behind that example at that high level. So I think leadership, extremely important, and then also building governance structures that support that. So some of the examples I'll talk about is even just a budget for promoting conservation from the National Treasury, putting aside money for that, sharing the money that has come from tourism to really support even more growth of conservation. So really getting that treasury priority is because the leadership of the country has made it really important. So I think that leadership is a very, very important factor. The second one is partnerships. Really finding people that you can work with, organizations that you can work with, universities like ALU that you can work with to support a common goal. So for us, it's been partnerships with wildlife organizations. African Parks, for example, manages one of our national parks, and they've done a good job doing that. We wouldn't have been able to do that alone without a partnership like them. Working with I said universities such as ALU, but also hotels and lodges, and you know, the Ellen Foundation that has just been established to work with the Dian Fossey Foundation, all these gorilla doctors. So really, these kinds of partnerships have been very important, and we see it as a very important concept moving forward, working with organizations that have a similar mindset and building the common value. The third one has been also just having an open policy as a country, because we're promoting conservation, but we're also promoting tourism. One of the key policies that we've put in place is opening up our skies. You know, you don't need a visa to come to Rwanda. You get a visa on arrival. You don't have to go to, you know, embassies looking, you know, to fill forms to come. You just make a decision to come to Rwanda, and at the airport you get your visa. And for countries that are from African Union, from the Francophonie organization, and from the Commonwealth, you don't even pay for any visa. It's free. Apart from getting it on arrival, which is easy, you also don't pay for it, which is really almost the whole world. You're talking about African Union, you're talking about La Francophonie, and you're talking about Commonwealth. I think you've almost covered the whole world. I'm sure Americans won't agree, but I think you've covered a big part of the world. So really an open policy has also been very important. The fourth one is making sure that also attraction of businesses, because you want businesses to take this value to something that creates jobs. So for us, it's been making it very easy for businesses to establish in Rwanda and convenient. We are currently ranked the second easiest place to do business on the African continent after Mauritius. And we make it easy. You can register your business within 6 hours. You can protect your transfer of property within 2 weeks, and many other examples of how we've made it really easy to start a business. And the last one is we should never forget communities. Communities are the immediate custodians that you want on your side. When you involve communities, you reduce poaching of these sites. You make sure that they also very much closely interlinked with the objectives on the national park. And so for us, the communities and bringing them on board has been extremely important. We even share the money that we make from national parks with communities. Every year, we set aside 10% of the money that we make from selling permits from gorillas and other national parks. We give it to communities, and they use this money to do what they choose as a community. It could be to improve water systems, it could be to bring solar power, it could be building a school, medical facilities, and all these projects have been done by these communities. So really also making them benefit directly as a community has been very important in making them custodians of conservation. Thank you.
Claire, thank you. And I think that gives a real insight into the enabling environment that the leadership has created for investment into the wildlife sector. Fred, just going back to your big four, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned those big four, and it's extraordinary. It's almost astonishing to hear about this $400 million that's out there looking for a carbon sink to invest in. What's it going to take to scale the big four to have a big impact on the continent?
Sure, Max. So what I ultimately believe is that we need a complete reimagination of the possibilities for wildlife and nature in Africa, not just, and in fact, globally. So despite this potential that we talked about, conservation today, I would characterize it very much as a dying industry. And even the use of the term conservation connotates protecting a scarce resource. And it's very much this sort of, it's in defensive mode. And we're trying to protect this shrinking asset. And so what I believe we need to do is to really reimagine and the sector to think about what would it take to actually create abundance so that we're not protecting a shrinking asset, we're actually growing it. We have aligned incentives so much that we are, we're actually allocating more land to be protected. And we are, we are seeing an increase in numbers of wildlife, etc. Right? And I think that, for me, is really the highest level what needs to happen. So in my mind, there are three things that need to come together for any industry to grow. The first, if you look at sectors like technology or the financial service, etc., the first thing you find is that they need an enabling environment, and this comes from leadership at the highest levels. So as Claire was just mentioning in Rwanda, this is something that's prioritized by President Kagame himself, right? And policy and legislation follows. So things like private ownership of wildlife that I was talking about, that South Africa did, which really capitalized its sector. Community rights to resources, like in Rwanda, where 10% goes to the community. If you don't have that enabling environment, that industry won't grow. So that's the first thing that countries need to get right. The second, I believe, is that all growth industries need talent. Right? When you see the sexiest industries like finance and tech and everything, all young people want to work in those industries. So unless we can get that happening in conservation, we won't really be able to see this thing grow. So when young people in Africa who can actually build and manage these businesses, the next generation of entrepreneurs, if they see this as a place where they can create a career and build wealth, that's when we'll see this thing grow. So we've got to make conservation sexy. Young people must think as conservation as an alternative to going to Goldman Sachs or Google or working at McKinsey, and so I'm actually going into conservation. And so we've got to rebrand the sector and really attract some of the best brains in Africa to go into this. And that's why we created the School of Wildlife Conservation, to create that next generation of top African talent that can actually see this as a growth sector. And the third thing that all growth industries have is that they must make money, right? And so if a sector is not growing, if it's not profitable, it just won't grow. It will continue to remain dependent on donors, and that is obviously not sustainable. It's limited. So we need business models that are innovative, that are not dependent on donors. One example I always like to give is in Kenya, the Opojeta Conservancy. It's run by Richard Vine, and he really thinks of himself as a conservation entrepreneur. So I think he has a budget of about $7 million, and he covers all of it and even makes a profit, but from many things, right? There's, he has obviously. People come there for tourism in the his reserve, but he's also built a real estate business where they built homes that you can buy for $350,000, and then you visit once a year, right? But you have to pay the levies, et cetera, minimum impact of environment, but it's generating income. And then he has a ranching business in there, and he's got a farming business on it, and he's got so many other businesses. He was even telling me the other day that he's been thinking about creating the longest golf hole in the world. You can go there and play it, and then you get a T-shirt that says, you played the longest golf hole in the world, and you needed an armed escort to ward off the lions and elephants, right? So he's thinking creatively about how to create, and as a result, he's generating profit, and then that profit gets invested in the communities around Opojeta. So we need to look at it that way, and if that happens, this is really going to take off.
Yeah, Fred, I couldn't agree with you more. Reimagining of the sector so that it becomes more attractive, a growth sector rather than a sort of defeatist, retreating sector, as I think many people perceive it to be now, it would be a wonderful outcome for wildlife and natural habitat. Now, obviously, in the current crisis, this COVID crisis, all this conversation about growth seems a bit academic, and I'm really curious to know, Claire, because so much has been invested by the Rwandan leadership into building your wildlife economy. So much effort into attracting all these brands you mentioned, the Radissons, the Singitas, and now we find ourselves in a situation where international tourism visitors has practically become nothing. What will Rwanda learn from this experience, and what might we expect to see in terms of diversification of the sector going forward?
Well, I think first of all, there's no doubt that COVID-19 has had and will have a huge impact negatively on our economy. I think that's very clear. We have been closed, for international tourism from March. We expect to reopen our borders on the 1st of August, but we also know it's going to take time to go back to pre-COVID-19 levels. So we know that this impact is huge, and we can't be very sure what the future looks like. So how we've approached it as a country is to really think, and Freddie talked about reimagining, and that's a process that is going to be continuous. One of the areas that we're looking at is, can we actually create value from virtual reality experiences of our wildlife? We've had examples of looking at gorillas from virtual reality. Is that something that we can develop into a product? Of course, it will never be the same as being next to a gorilla, but is that a product that we can also develop, combining our IT sector and also our tourism sector? So we're thinking along those lines to really see how do we reduce the dependence on travel. If a shock such as COVID-19 happens, how do we make sure that in future we mitigate the impact of that? So that's really the thinking that we're having today. And 6 months of a complete shutdown is a very big impact, and maybe it will even be more going forward. The other one is also we've set up something that we call the Economic Resilience Fund. The initial size of the fund is $100 million. This has been mostly government that has put this fund through the financial system in the country. And what this does is that it has given very, very affordable interest rates money to the tourism sector, among others. Half of it is just dedicated to tourism and conservation. And hotels or businesses can restructure their loans, get a 2-year grace period, and restructure to 15 years through this fund that's there. And the idea is we want to encourage them to think about new ways of survival, new ways of resilience, without having a very, very bad economic impact that they cannot even be, there to think about the future. So it's really making them survive, but at the same time, thinking about resilience and giving this facility in form of a fund to be able to arrive there. So that's really what we're thinking in terms of supporting businesses to think, but also I think, how do you combine the digital aspect of experiences with tourism and conservation? And that's something we're going to be exploring very much in the future. Thank you.
No, and that's really interesting, Claire, and remarkable that the government has put aside that facility to help the sector get through as a bridge. I think that's desperately what the sector requires right now, is a bridge and a safety net, whether it's credit facilities or grants. And the fact that Rwanda has taken that step, it really shows extraordinary leadership. Really, really interesting. And obviously it's a very difficult period. I love the idea of being able to go on a virtual reality tour with the gorillas in Rwanda. But that's one way of getting getting more people into the reserve without affecting the gorillas. So that's a brilliant. Very good to see how that goes. Fred, you've focused your considerable talents into building this African wildlife, this African wildlife leadership program, creating new African conservationists, reimagining the sector, making it attractive so people don't go to Goldman Sachs, they come and become conservationists instead. And now we've had COVID hit us like this, and I don't know what message that's sending out to budding African conservationists. Given this current situation, do you think it's a career that you'll tell your students is still worth pursuing at the African Leadership University?
Definitely, yes. I think what we've learned from COVID-19 is that we need to diversify our wildlife industry, right? And Claire has shared some great examples of that. All it takes is imagination, right? Virtual reality to see gorillas. That's great. And you charge everyone. You make it a subscription business or something, right? People are paying you, $5 a month, $10 a month, and they can always put on those goggles and see what the gorillas are doing at any given time. How cool would that be? And you don't even need to pay the gorillas. You need to come in there and unionize the gorillas in Rwanda if you're going to. But I think that, so one thing that's become clear is that, dependence on international ecotourism is risky, and we need to really, there's still opportunity. For example, we can build domestic tourism markets, right? We can develop other uses of wildlife that are of interest to both international and domestic consumers. And I think the way I look at it is Africa's development game is a long-term thing. It's not a short-term thing. Yes, COVID is here, for the moment, but we're not going to live with COVID forever. And so as we, develop these young leaders, we want them to think beyond the immediate time and really encourage entrepreneurship in the sector. And, I think it's actually more important now than ever to encourage the youth to follow careers in conservation and to build wildlife economies, right? Because as we've seen, the linkages between human health and the natural environment are clear. And there's never been a more important time than now to invest in wildlife and natural resources. If we're going to really have a healthy world. So, I think one of the if you look at what has been happening in the last, decade or the last few decades, the world's focus almost purely on development has been to the detriment of the environment. And now we're seeing the damage and the problems that this causes. So I think we need to reset, reboot, and really rethink how we move forward. And I think investment in wildlife conservation and sustainable wildlife economies, there's never been a better time for young people to actually make this a priority. Because not only, it does the world need it, but if you use your imagination and really reframe conservation from this something that needs to be protected to something that you need to invest in. So one of the things that I think we should probably maybe even do is like rebrand it. Let's call it environmental investing. So when you're at a cocktail pub and they say, what do you do? I'm an environmental investor. I'm growing the sector, and that's the kind of thing that we need to do if we're really going to achieve the full potential. So absolutely, young people still should go into it.
So you're going to be producing EIs, environmental investors, EIs all over the place. This is wonderful. I love it. I'm an EI. I like that. But also your enthusiasm, and Fred, I have to agree. I think that if anything's been laid bare by the COVID crisis, it's the reality that we're all completely dependent, intrinsically dependent on the health of these natural ecosystems, on the health of the planet for our own health. And so there's got to be a lot more flows of support to ensuring those stay protected. You can't run a business, you can't breathe unless the environments are protected. So hopefully this is the big wake-up call that's needed to create a huge army of EIs out there enthusiastically protecting the source of life for all of us.
Investing in it.
Say that again?
Investing in it, not only protecting it. Yes,
I said the wrong word. I said the wrong word. See, I'm caught in the old mindset. I haven't reimagined the sector yet. Claire, I just love talking about Rwanda, and Rwanda is such a beacon to the world. In the same way, I think that Bhutan, the way they've managed their wildlife economy has been very interesting and very sensitive, but Rwanda's taken it such a step further. This notable success that is Rwanda, what lessons are there for building the wildlife economy of the rest of Africa? Not just the rest of Africa, the rest of the world. What lessons do you think you can share that would help inform key decisions around building this economy elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Max. I want to also offer our experience in thinking about domestic tourism. Rwanda, like many other countries on the continent, have relied on international tourism by far. I mean, the biggest chunk, almost all, the money that we made from tourism was international tourists. But of course, with COVID-19, one of the rethinking that we had to do is how do we develop an interest to travel within the country among Rwandans, basically domestic tourism. And so we opened in June, on the 17th of June, we opened domestic tourism before the airport can open. And we started a campaign about traveling within the country and promoting packages. We gave discounts for gorilla permits. For example, if you're Rwandan, it's $200 instead of $1,500. If you're a foreign resident living in Rwanda, it's $500. And we've started to see, tourism picking up within the first weeks. It's not even a month yet. Actually, I think it's a month tomorrow. We saw some national parks getting up to 23% of their revenues, which is a good start for the first month. And but also in doing that, we had to be very careful about COVID-19 because you have to balance the health. The health scare hasn't gone away. And so what we're doing is for every person that visits a national park in Rwanda during this domestic tourism campaign, we have them tested. So you cannot go to say gorilla without a certificate of COVID-19. And we don't charge extra for that. That's part of our public health protocols. And all the rangers, the park rangers, the hotels around the national parks, they're tested every 2 weeks just to make sure that, again, we're putting COVID-19 risk, trying to contain it as we begin to promote tourism again. So I wanted to just share that experience that we have for domestic tourism and also what government had to do to kind of ease some of the taxes, like pay-as-you-earn taxes for employment to continue in the tourism sector. So I think that has been helpful in beginning to bring some, life back to the tourism sector as we wait for international tourism to take over. Also, or to complement, hopefully this culture of domestic tourism will increase as a result of this experience from post-COVID-19. Now, back to your question, some of the lessons that Rwanda could share, in terms of making this sector of wildlife economy successful, but also contribute to economic development of the country. I think, as you said, Max, but also Fred said, investing in it. Wildlife economy, for it to have the impact, is not going to just happen on its own. It's going to take investing in it, and investing in it at different levels. For government, it's really investing in conservation, in park rangers, in making sure they have decent jobs, decent livelihoods. It's also making sure that you're investing in security. Security is extremely important because you want safety of the animals, but you also want safety of the people around the national parks. You also want, when people visit your country or people visit your communities, you want to guarantee security, and that's going to be taken care of by investing in it. So there are many components at the government level, at the private sector level, at the community levels. We all have to invest time and resources to make sure that actually this wildlife economy is protected, but also is optimized. The second one is also making sure that we just value the environment, and it has to be consistent and comprehensive. We can't talk about the wildlife economy outside the rest of the environment. So making sure that environment and nature is very much given the value that it deserves, and that's going to be in the regulations that you put in place. It's going to be in your allocation of budgets. It's going to be in your allocation of security and many other aspects, just because you have to continue giving that value. Again, making it pro people. People must feel, you don't want a wildlife economy that just feels like it's something that is, exported and the people around have nothing to do with it. So making sure it's for people and the communities around, as I said, are benefiting as well. And again, of course, as I said before, partnerships and leadership, very, very important. We need to see that level of engagement with the leadership of the country, the leadership of communities, but also having the requisite partnerships to deliver. So for me, those aspects, once we cover those aspects, then I think that you really will optimize and make the biggest value that you can have from a wildlife economy. Thank you.
Amazing, and I think very clear, and I think it would be wonderful to see that experience shared more broadly, so that this economy could be built and we can be more forward-facing rather than backward-facing in terms of the sector as a whole. Really, really interesting. Thank you, Claire. I wish there were more people with that clarity everywhere globally to help build this wildlife economy. It's really, really, really insightful. We've got quite a few questions from the audience, and there's one for you, Fred, around hunting. Specifically, you mentioned hunting as one of the potential big four. Isn't this a dying industry, trophy hunting?
So I think hunting is something that has historically had quite some negative perceptions. But one of the things that we believe is that if it's managed correctly, it can actually contribute to conservation, to employment, to livelihoods, and the national economy. In South Africa, hunting is actually the largest contributor to the wildlife sector. It's especially important in marginal areas, because not every wild place is amenable to tourism and some of the other wildlife economy activity. So, but like anything, any industry, it needs standards, it needs regulations, and but it's clear that if it's properly managed, it is something that can be an important part of the wildlife economy. One thing that's also important to realize that's often misunderstood is that, in countries like the US and South Africa, almost all hunting that happens is for meat and not for trophies, right? And so, if it's regulated and, you think about how it can be done in a humane way, etc., it is one of the opportunities that we at least have to explore. The more you diversify your income streams from other sources, and the more creatively you think about it, then obviously the less you have to look at things like hunting. But it's something that we at least need to understand the value that it creates. We need to think about how you can regulate it. We can't just ignore it. We need to think about how do we actually manage it, etc., because it is something that has historically been a very important reason why actually humans want to conserve nature.
Yeah, Fred, and very well handled as a hot potato. So well done with that. And it obviously is controversial, but I think it's important at the same time that we hear all sides of that discussion. I think it's as you say, diversification is such an important part to ensuring that the sector thrives. There's a real challenge, and there's a question that's coming up which is very, very interesting. And Fred, I think it'd be interesting to know what your thoughts are on this, which is, what's the relationship between wildlife conservation management and the need for large-scale food production, especially in light of the projected population growth in the continent?
So that's a very interesting question. Because at the end of the day, conservation is competition for land. It's a land use, and you've got to show people that which land use is more valuable to them. I cut down forests and sell the firewood, or I conserve it and I get benefits from my 10% from Rwandan gorillas or from carbon payments that come to me, etc. So that's really what's going on. One of the things that I see happening is, while Africa's population is growing, the good news for conservation is that Africa is urbanizing at the fastest rate in the world. About 5 years ago, projections showed that 800 million people were going to move into African cities by 2050. So the pressures that are being experienced in the rural areas where a lot of wildlife exists should diminish as more and more people move into cities, and you should be able to that should hopefully reduce pressure on protected areas and actually allow But that means carefully planning our cities, managing migration so that it actually is healthy, etc., etc. The other thing that obviously can be done is to really think about agricultural methods that are far less land intensive. So leveraging technology, drip irrigation methods, etc., so that you can grow the food that you need with much, much less land than we need. And that just comes from technology, fertilizer, etc. So if we modernize agriculture and the combination of plus the combination of urbanization that's happening, it's not a given that the two will compete with each other. you can actually have both thriving, where we can have enough food to eat in Africa and give more and more land and more space for nature. And that's really where we need to go, in my opinion. Again, it starts with leadership at the top.
Yeah, it starts with leadership and also reimagining both the conservation sector and the food production sector, actually. I think that whole role of urbanization is often forgotten. And I recall going to Gabon about 10 years ago and going out into rural areas, and there were no young people. Like, where are the young people? There were people who were old, there were tiny kids, but the young people were gone. They'd left. The sort of rural environment was effectively in a state of decay in some ways. Not everywhere, of course, but in some places. And they're like, well, they've gone to the cities, of course. Why would they stay here? They've gone to get jobs. So really, that really struck me back then. I think it is an important part of that. But very good question. Thanks for that from the audience. There's a wonderful question here, Claire, and I think it has to go to you, which is around, and I think we'll finish on this, but it's around women in conservation, particularly women in Africa. And the question is, it says here, women in Africa are often a minority, especially in leadership, when it comes to conservation development. And, Rwanda seems to be consistently pushing for equality across all sectors. So what are the key lessons here for other countries to emulate when it comes to empowering and giving women steering roles in conservation and other critical industries, but conservation?
Okay, thank you. I think gender equality has been very important in Rwanda. I think one of the things that you'll read about Rwanda is we've made that a priority across the sectors, from political leadership to businesses, among others. And I think the key lessons for us, or what we've done to make sure that women participate in the economy, including conservation, among others, maybe three very important elements. One of them is to include women. You have to be deliberate. It cannot just be, saying that, oh, anyone is free to apply for this job, or anyone is free to apply or participate. You must actually be very deliberate about including women and looking at who you have in terms of employment, and saying, out of these 10,000 jobs that I have, how many women? Or out of 10 leadership positions, how many women? And making sure that there is actually space that is reserved for women. Otherwise, it won't just happen on its own. So being very deliberate about inclusiveness for women has been very important. And the second thing for us has been also opening up the space, being deliberate, making sure that you want women, to be part of the employment or the different roles. But the second part is empowering these women to make sure that they have the skills, they have the capacity to do that. So really looking for women that have potential, taking them and exposing them to building their capacity and competences so that they can really be ready to take on these positions has been very important. So for us, even in conservation, we have a school of conservation called Kitavi School of Conservation. We make sure that women are part of the schools. We make sure that it's not just the men that are actually being trained so that they can take on these jobs. The last part has been role models. For us, it's been very important that more women are given a platform for others to learn or to see and get inspiration from. So we get women that are doing well in different sectors, whether it's conservation, we get a ranger who's a woman, we get a pilot who's a woman, and we make sure that we give them platforms to talk about their stories, and the idea is inspiration for the others. So for us, these three elements, being deliberate, empowering the women to take on the positions, but also using these women who are successful to inspire the rest, has been very important for us in gender promotion, or women taking up these positions.
Claire, thank you so much, and you're an inspiration. So it's wonderful listening to you. It's been a real honor to have you on our webinar tonight. Fred, as ever, out the box thinking, reimagining the sector and helping be an inspiration to women and men across the continent. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you both. And thank you everyone who tuned in today. And we will be having future webinars really around this whole subject. I mean, as you know, conservation is complex. It's amazing what we touched upon just tonight in terms of its importance for our collective health, in terms of its importance for driving economies, in terms of giving employment, in terms of inspiring and providing gender equality. I mean, this is an important subject for all of us. Every single human being is alive. So it's a pleasure that you all to speak to we have now this wonderful campaign, the Independent and Evening Standard, called Stop the Illegal Wildlife Trade. These webinars are now falling under that banner. There's a whole series of stories that have been created by those newspapers, so you can go on and see what those stories are about in terms of the sector as a whole, of what's happening with the illegal wildlife trade, how to combat it. And this particular webinar will no doubt be featured. And we're looking forward to having discussions outside of these webinars with both Clare and Fred to help inform decisions going forward. So thanks again, everyone, for zooming in. Over to you, Charlie. Wonderful to have a wonderful evening. Thanks. Bye.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to echo you there, Max, and say a huge thank you to you, Fred and Clare. You both speak with such passion and clarity on these pressing topics, and have shed some vital light on some issues that have no doubt been on the minds of our audience. Max, as always, you guide the conversation so elegantly. So yeah, a big thank you to you all for joining us and making this talk possible. The Arts Club is so proud to partner with Space for Giants in this Giant Conversation series. We're always in awe at the brilliant wildlife conservation work they do, whether it be through mobilizing governments, working to change legislation, engaging key experts in the conservation space, or educating and working alongside communities on the ground, and of course curating fantastic speakers for these events. For those of you who may have missed any previous installments of the Giant Conversation series, I would highly recommend watching them back. You can find the links for these in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Some of the speakers that Space for Giants have curated in previous talks include William Hague, Shamani Jayanathan, Criminal Justice Advisor for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, John Scanlon, Chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, Max Gamira, Director of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services at the United Nations, Grace Gabriel, IFAW's Regional Director for Asia, and so many more. You will also find a link to sign up to the Space for Giants newsletter in the chat box, in case you're not already signed up. So thank you all so much once again for joining us. Please do stay tuned for future installments of the Giant Conversation series with Space for Giants. I'll now leave you with a short video which outlines some of the great work that Space for Giants do. Thank you all once again, and a very good night to you all. Thank you.
Finding a balance between economic growth and conservation is one of our planet's biggest challenges. As the area of land given over to farmland expands to grow crops for Africa's rapidly increasing population, wildlife habitat is encroached upon more and more. And along the boundary between human settlements and wilderness areas, human-elephant conflict is on the rise. Paul Jiroge has had his crop destroyed and neighbours injured by elephants, but last year Space for Giants completed a fence not far from here, and things are dramatically different today.
Wow, when the elephants came, you know, they used to come almost every day. Even when I was far, I was fearing about my family.
Okay.
So in the morning when they were to go to school, we had also to make sure that there are no elephants along the way.
In a bid to end this conflict, Space for Giants is building electrified fences that give elephants a harmless low pulse of electricity that steers them away from the farmland. So how are the farmers reacting to the fencing so far?
Farmers are very happy. There is already relief, and now they are able to sleep through the night without staying out to guard their crops.
But another big part of the answer is the potential to understand that these magnificent animals can be precious allies, not costly enemies. This is Loisaba Tented Camp, operated by Elewana. It's one of 2 lodges in Loisaba that provide tourists with a luxury safari experience, from the accommodation to the wildlife encounters. A substantial proportion of the camp's revenue supports conservation and local communities.
We've been able to put up a dispensary. We've put up also a school in the community, which is really working well, because now we've got more kids going to school to learn not only how to read and write, but also about the wildlife.
Space for Giants brings investment into landscapes like this. Businesses create jobs and buy from local suppliers. They drive the national economy and make conservation a valuable industry. This is what securing habitats means. Their assets, the wildlife and the natural beauty, become something both governments and people want to fight to protect.